Yes. Good morning, DawgNation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Breda Pest Management. And this is also day 3 of our DawgNation Roundtable. Monday, kind of an outlook for the Georgia offense. Day 2, a little bit of an outlook for the Georgia defense. Today, here on this Wednesday, we're going to kind of dive deeper into the outlook for some of Georgia's freshmen. It's always fun to think about newcomers and how they might fit into the overall picture for Georgia here this year. With our roundtable folks, Mike Griffith and Connor Riley and Jeff Sintel, we're going to talk about some of that today. In fact, as you know, if you've been with us, a little bit different than a normal show. We're making the roundtable more than just like a guest spot. It's essentially the main content for the show, and I think it's been going great. I hope you've been enjoying it too. We think it gets even better today, so we're glad you're with us for it. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Breda Pest Management, the official pest control of UGA athletics.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
Another great day of DawgNation Roundtable coverage coming up. We always get really good feedback when we do this. We wanted to try to save this for a special week. Our DawgNation crews felt like the right time to do it. In just a moment with Jeff Sintel and Connor Riley and Mike Griffith, we're going to be talking a little bit more about the freshmen most likely to play significant roles for Georgia this year. And I think it's interesting to speak about that for a couple of reasons. You go back and look a year ago, for instance, we saw a freshman play a pretty big role for Georgia. Think about a guy like KJ Bolden, for instance. And Bolden, I think, in a role for Georgia last year, performed in such a way that you think can have a very, very bright future, and that bright future could be in the present tense, in the immediate, for Georgia here in 2025. We're going to talk more about that tomorrow. And yet there's also kind of a greedy factor with college football fans, and I'm putting myself at the front of that conversation, in that while Bolden had a really good freshman year a season ago and got to play a lot for Georgia, I think there's a thought that Georgia either could have or maybe even needs to have even better play or more substantial impact from at least one or two freshmen here this season. And as I said before, that's a little bit greedy because, players of Bolden's caliber don't always come around each and every year. But there's also a lot to like about some of these Georgia freshmen here this season. And as Kirby Smart himself has even acknowledged, we're also in kind of a day and age in which used to be freshmen were your third stringers, they're your fourth stringers, they're guys that you played if you were up 55-0 in the fourth quarter. But as Smart himself has said about his own evaluation of Georgia spring practice, it seems like a lot more frequently now you see freshmen kind of showing up in your 2D. That as the talent in the sport gets more dispersed and as transfers and things like that become more of a reality. Of course, the transfer portal remains open here right now. But as all of that continues, there's just a greater opportunity for freshmen to play, and for the teams they play on, perhaps a greater necessity for those freshmen to step up. So the question we're going to ask today is, well, who are those guys for Georgia? And I would say, and it's kind of interesting, on Monday I began by kind of sort of throwing a prediction out there of how much will we hear so-and-so name. I would say one of the names that we're probably about to hear a lot as we kind of get into this, and I think rightly so, based on everything that I've heard, that's the freshman running back, Bo Walker. Now, that doesn't mean that Walker is going to be first team All-SEC or, the future Bo or the future Walker for someone who's got, the very famous combined name for former SEC greats at running back. It doesn't necessarily say how high the top-end level of the performance is going to be necessarily. But it does seem like a natural consequence to the very, very tangible buzz that existed for him during large scale, on a very large scale during spring practice. He was just talked about an awful lot to the point where you think we're about to be talking about him a whole lot more as you kind of roll through this spring practice. I think stuff like, or I should say, in the aftermath of spring practice, kind of rolling through the rest of the offseason, getting ready for the upcoming season. I think stuff like this is really fun. For those of us who are Georgia fans or for those who cover Georgia on a regular basis, every year Georgia kind of brings in that kind of elite recruiting class. This past year for the class of 2025, ranked number 2 in the country. That means that Georgia's going to have a list of potential impact players that is as long, if not longer, than any of them. So who are the guys that either will or could break out here this year? I think Mike Griffith, Jeff Sintel, Connor Raleigh will have a lot to say about that today. I've got my own thoughts too. So let's get ready to do that as a part of our DawgNation Roundtable. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Breda Pest Management. Before we get to the roundtable today and look at these Georgia freshmen, let's remind you all of this made possible by our friends at Breda Pest Management. While we love freshmen around Georgia, it's also important to note the folks at Breda Pest Management, they are not freshmen. They are not first year doing this. They've been doing this since 1975. They had 125 employees stretch all across our market area, and they're serving people each and every day, really living up to their billing as the official pest control provider of UGA Athletics. That means when you make the switch to Breda Pest Management, not only do you get the prestige of working and the knowledge that you're working with the same company that Georgia chooses to work with, but you also get the extra benefit of putting more money back in your pocket just for making that decision. That is what Breda Pest Management's all about. You're already working with a termite company because in Georgia you essentially need one, but maybe you're not happy with that company. Well, when you make the switch to Breda, not only will you be happier, you'll also be a little richer for that decision, putting more money back in your pocket just for doing that. So by now you know the website because I've been saying it for a long time. I even spell it for you each and every week as well, and today will be no different. Find them online. It's BredaPest.com. BREDA, BredaPest.com. One more time, that's BREDA, BredaPest.com. So glad to have BredaPest.com as a part of DawgNation Daily here today. And without further ado, as promised, happy to have Mike, Connor, Jeff with us too. Georgia freshmen, could be some good ones, could be a major impact or two to be found from that 2025 class, but who will those guys be? What do you say we talk about that right now?
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
And here on DawgNation Daily, not only will we do day 3 of our DawgNation Roundtable here, but we'll also kind of roll into Around the Doghouse, presented by our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau. And I've been looking forward to this roundtable day in particular because it's a chance to talk about some of these coveted freshmen on this Georgia roster for 2025. And maybe no surprise that I want to begin with Jeff Sintel on this here today. Jeff, for a moment, I want to look at freshmen that could make an immediate impact for Georgia. And I guess let's start on offense. And if we start on offense, it seems like you kind of have to start with Bo Walker just because of how much talk there was about Walker during the spring. He also had like the sort of explosive run in G-Day that at least seemed to validate some of what we had heard. Do you ever worry, though, that at some point it's kind of gotten out of control and it's too much? Because honestly, even though I like the hyperbole, I don't like putting too much on any one player. Is there ever a point when it gets to be maybe a little too much for a guy like Walker who has not done it in a game yet and really didn't have the kind of recruiting ranking that you sometimes expect this sort of buzz to be around? Is the chatter around Walker justified as far as your perspective would lead you to believe?
Brandon, I think it is. I think it is because nobody's expecting him to come in and lead the room. He's closer to starting and getting real snaps and maybe real carries against Tennessee than most might have expected with what's going on with Robinson's, the health of those two guys. I just think, with Bo, there's a lot of he knows how to do things, Brandon. I mean, he is a 3-time state champion. He is acclimated at 2 different types of programs, from Cedar Grove to a boarding school with a lot of European players at Raven Gap. And, he's faced, big-time competition as being a bell cow. I think he had to get into better shape. but he's awfully hard to find behind those behemoth Georgia offensive linemen. And really, Brandon, he's really hard to get on the ground, and he's also versatile in the passing game. So, again, with a lot of these cases and a lot of these special freshmen, you don't really have to hang too much on him. If you want to say, Bo Walker, can you go be Georgia's third leading rusher in 2025 and maybe threaten to be number 2 and maybe lead the team in rushing a game or two? I think he's capable of doing all that. I mean, Brandon, Georgia's at a place where his program, where they're not going to put lofty expectations on a freshman until those 5-star quarterbacks get here.
That's interesting. So if I were to keep it just the offensive side of the ball for right now, do you see another freshman on offense making an immediate impact?
Well, immediate impact is the germane term right there.
For sure.
I think, I mean, this is what I think, and this is probably one of my more pointed takes about Georgia this year, is I feel Georgia will have 4 to 5 wide receivers better than anybody they had last year, especially by the time the freshmen cut their teeth in the middle of the season. That's no disrespect to Arian Smith and Dominic Lovett, who I kind of feel were way higher up on the Georgia depth chart than they ever thought they should be. But with freshmen, I'm looking is, Dylan Bell is an obvious, Colby Young's an obvious, Branch and Thomas are an obvious. I think both C.J. Wiley and Talon Taylor, they can be that number 5. One of those two guys should probably wind up the number 5 receiver at Georgia this year. And I think that's not too much of an ask. And when you think number 5 receiver at Georgia, are you thinking 30 catches, 400 yards, 5 touchdowns? I think both of those guys are capable of a little bit more than that, depending on health and depth charts and how certain game plans go. But those guys kind of showed it over and over. I think C.J. Wiley really turned a lot of heads because of his size, his physicality, and just the way he can cover ground with that length. Of course, when you flash a one-handed catch, that's going to catch everybody's attention. But I think those are the guys on offense in terms of those special freshmen. Now, I could go another 4 minutes about Elijah Griffin and how I think that he's going to be something.
Well, we'll get to the defense side here in a minute. Yeah, we'll definitely. Yeah. So you put a pin in that because we also got some cool video we can show of Elijah Griffin. So we'll get to all of that here coming up in just a little bit. Connor, let me, though, follow up on what Jeff was saying about receiver, because to me, this is a very interesting conversation from the perspective of a fan, because we have a tendency to fixate on the freshman wide receivers that are very good. And why wouldn't you? Jeremiah Smith, obviously Ryan Williams, who maybe you heard was 17 years old a year ago. Even a guy like, Cam Coleman at Auburn. When a freshman receiver is really good, we have a tendency to fixate on them. But that obscures the larger point, which is freshman is actually, I should say, wide receiver is actually a really hard position for freshmen to play. That the outstanding ones are so up into the right on the plot graph of wide receiver performance that we don't actually realize that in a given year in the SEC, there aren't that many freshmen that have very successful seasons at wide receiver. All of that, though, to say, on this Georgia team in this particular year, given the size of the need and the quality of the signees, if Georgia doesn't have at least a couple of these freshman wide receivers who do make an immediate impact, I think it actually counts as a disappointment. Don't you agree?
I think so, especially just given the resources that they've put into this position. Yes, you bring in Noah Thomas and Zachariah Branch from the transfer portal, but Georgia always knew it was going to have to recruit the receiver position well, and it did that in the 2025 recruiting cycle. Talon Taylor is the first 5-star receiver Georgia has landed since George Pickens. I think Pickens falls into that upper right echelon bucket. He led Georgia in receiving as a true freshman there. But even someone like, Don Blaylock, and I'm sure those at home, go ahead, get your drink in. A season like that, he was very successful making big plays for Georgia, even though he only finished, I think, that year with 300 yards receiving. I think that's sort of maybe the tent pole or the model that we look for in terms of what these guys can do. And I think with Talon Taylor in particular, because Georgia doesn't totally have a receiver like him, maybe London Humphreys is a little bit similar in terms of body type. I think that there's a role for him to be carved out. Now, Humphreys looked great in spring. So did Dylan Bell. I think the versatility might make it hard for these guys to come in and play just a specific role, because I think that's what Talon Taylor, C.J. Wiley, even Landon Rolden are going to be limited to. but how quickly they're able to pick things up is going to go a long way. And so I think, because even you can point to a season ago, Nitro Tuggle, Sokovia White at times show like, hey, these guys are capable of doing more. I'm just interested in seeing what we see from these guys this year and what, how the wide receiver position as a whole does, because if Thomas produces, if Humphreys produces, if Bell produces, if Branch produces, there's not going to be the same, I think, necessity to see a Talon Taylor break out, to see a CJ Wiley break out. And so, these guys can absolutely help this wide receiver room, but because of what Georgia has at the position ahead of them, I don't think it's the same need that I think we all sat thinking it would be in the end of last season, given how last year ended for Georgia.
How about a different name from you? Do you have one? Because I'll tell you this. I'll tell you this. There's a name that I sort of want somebody to mention, and it's on offense, and some of this is related to spring practice buzz that no one said yet. I'm going to get maybe Michael say it when it's his turn here in a second, but honestly, I have to admit there's a name that I'm sort of hoping to hear somebody say. Would you like to have a guess as who it is?
See, BA does the daily podcast for us here at DawgNation Daily, and he's got to do headlines, and I don't know if freshman offensive linemen always do the best headlines.
But you're getting close to where I'm going here.
And I'm going to take Juan Gaston.
That's who I want somebody to mention. Because if you add a guy like this who, so far, the buzz about him is far greater than I expected it to be, and Georgia could use a little extra spice in the offensive line, I was hoping somebody would say that. I was hoping somebody would say Gaston.
And I'll tell you this, one, the most important thing with Juan is that he's got to get his body weight under control. Came in, I think, close to 380 pounds. He's down around 360, 365 this spring. They're looking to get him into that 340, 330 range there. What I found interesting about Juan, you see that size there, and you think, oh, that's just naturally an offensive tackle. And Georgia does have some questions there. But Gaston was at the second-team offensive guard spot on G-Day, and specifically at the right guard position. And that right guard spot, I think, is very much up for grabs. Daniel Calhoun misses time with a foot injury, not expected to be serious, but I think anytime you see a guy at that size, it does raise some concerns there. Michael Inouye got the start on G-Day there, but Gaston has a lot of upside, and he brings a lot of just physicality. And I think given that Georgia has a need at guard right now, he could be able to step in there, maybe not as a starter, but as someone who rotates in and plays along the line of scrimmage. I think that's certainly something that can help Georgia this year. Because as you point out, BA, I think there were a lot of us that were wait and see about how things go, especially with freshman offensive linemen, just because we rarely see them contribute at Georgia anymore. But Gaston really rose up the rankings at the end of the 2025 recruiting cycle, pushed his way into being a top 100 prospect. I believe it was a 5-star per 247 Sports. And then he comes into Georgia right away, and the buzz is immediate in terms of what he brings to this offensive line room. So I know a lot of people thought it might be at the tackle position. I think maybe now with the way things are shaking out, he could help out at guard right away. But Juan Gaston is absolutely someone to pay attention to over the course of the season for Georgia on this offensive line that needs to play a lot better than it did a season ago.
That video was just awe-inspiring. I thought he might be a little too big coming out of high school because he's larger than commercial real estate. But my gosh, what a big man and pretty interesting buzz. Mike, how about another, if there's one left, or if you want to echo what's been said here about some of these freshmen for now on the offensive side of the ball that Mike can make that immediate impact?
Well, I'm kind of surprised. I mean, this is maybe in a little gray area, but there's a redshirt freshman that I think is going to make a really big impact, probably the biggest impact on offense since Ladd McConkey. I see why Kirby Smart is excited about Chauncey Bowens. This guy at 225 has got some wiggle, some burst. He's got a year in the system. I think he's a guy that even when they get a running back out of the portal, which I'm assuming they're going to do, I really like Bowens a lot. And when Kirby kept throwing his name out there last year, in the same sentence with Peanut Phillips, the gadget player, the fast guy, I mean, that's cute. That's nice. But who's a guy that can carry the ball over the goal line with some ball security, some power, and some elusivity? And I saw it from Bowens in the spring game. Now, maybe it's fool's gold. It was just one scrimmage. But I saw some upside there. And remember, Kirby Smart was once a running backs coach at Georgia under Mark Richt. I think he evaluates running backs very well. And I'm all in on Chauncey Bowens. I think Chauncey Bowens is going to have a productive year. I think he's going to be a difference maker, and I'll go so far as to say he's going to get the game ball after one of the games this season.
Oh, that's an interesting prediction. We'll do bold predictions tomorrow. Mike already kind of providing one right there. In fact, that's a good place for us to go ahead and call it Around the Doghouse, presented today by our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau. Of course, we talk about these recruits and incoming freshmen. So many of them homegrown right here in our state. When it comes to that sort of thing, loving stuff that's homegrown, our people at Georgia Farm Bureau have been doing that for a long time, really making a name for themselves over the course of decades, if not a century, on the backs of supporting Georgia's farmers, being proud of our agricultural community, but the same level of service they have shown to those who put food on our tables, they can do that for you right now. You got to have auto insurance. You have insurance needs, home insurance, things like that, financial services needs. Our folks at Georgia Farm Bureau want to provide that for you. You can give them a call, 877-404-1050. That's 877-404-1050. You can also find them online, gfbinsurance.com. So great to have Georgia Farm Bureau presenting Around the Doghouse to us here today. Now, to move to the other side of the ball here for a moment, Mike, you just heard Jeff kind of dive into the Elijah Griffin conversation. I know we talked a lot yesterday about defensive line. I believe it's incredibly important for Georgia this year. I think it's also perhaps better than it was a season ago, and some veteran guys make that the case. Still think there could be room for Elijah Griffin to be a part of this rotation. Obviously, the former five-star signee. When you think about immediate impact players on defense, is Griffin on your list? And if not him, who else?
Well, I do think we're going to see a lot of Griffin. Inside information, he's going to play 3 different defensive line spots. And yes, you do that for versatility, but you also do that to keep a really talented kid on the field. And I say kid, but he looks like a grown man out there. The power, the speed, the attitude. Kirby has put the brakes on Jalen Carter comparisons for obvious reasons. I mean, Jalen Carter is one of one, as the head coach said. But I think Griffin brings a different dynamic in a defensive line room that I feel like has more energy. I feel like the leadership is going to be better. I feel like the health is going to be better. Remember at the start of last year, BA, there were some injuries there in that defensive line, and it kind of stunted the growth of what's typically, as you noted, a dominant defensive line. It's Griffin for me. I'm all in. I could try to be creative and clever, but to me, it's as simple as seeing this guy play, knowing what he's all about, knowing that they're prepping him at 3 positions. I think he's going to be on the field quite a bit, more than you might expect from a freshman in a defensive line group that I feel is relatively deep and talented.
Yeah, I won't pretend to be an X's and O's expert. I never have been one, but sort of seems like that classic guy that Georgia sort of likes over the ball on third downs, when they kind of go aggressive with the pass rush. He sort of feels like that kind of fit for Georgia. Jeff, you wanted to talk about him a minute ago. What do you kind of think about Griffin in his first year at Georgia?
Expectations high, and I think the expectations will be met. I think, and everybody looks for superlative statements, but I'm going to be surprised. I don't need to boast here or elevate him. I'm going to be surprised if he's probably not among Georgia's top 3 or 4 defensive linemen pretty quickly. And I think a lot of Xavier McLeod, that a guy that's name probably doesn't come up enough on these cover 4-ish, roundtable-ish type programs we do. It's as advertised. Brandon, think about this. I mean, you and I have been talking about recruiting for a long time. Normally there's some jockeying there for the number 1 defensive tackle in the country and the number 1 player in the state of Georgia. Brandon, there was absolute full stop 0 there for Griffin. He was just always that guy. I think he's one of those guys that shows up off the field for Georgia in terms of doing everything beyond the field in order to play right away. I think the mental aspect is great. I think he's really wired right with really strong type of goals. I remember Keith Brooking telling me waves of superlatives about Elijah Griffin, and that was pretty hard for a tech man to do that. But Keith Brooking was on the same Savannah Christian coaching staff for years, and he got to see Elijah Griffin up close. I think the main thing for Elijah, and everybody's wondering, freshman, is he going to hit the wall? He's going to be dealing with 21, 22-year-old guys blocking him. I'm excited to see, Brandon, him on a defensive line where he's not going to be the guy that catches that immediate double. He might be the second or third guy you do so. Mike is right. He can play on the edge. And if Georgia, here's a semi-easy prediction. If Georgia can't find what it needs at edge, a lot of the depth it needs at edge in the transfer portal in the next week or so, I think they've got a guy that they can throw out there in Elijah Griffin that can do some of those things to stop the run and play out there as well a little bit in terms of that and make an immediate impact, Brendan. At Georgia, what's an immediate impact? I think that's different in a lot of places, but I think Elijah Griffin is the type of guy that could, I said earlier, he could be a top 3, top 4 defensive lineman on this team in year one. And that might be the only year he's not the top defensive lineman on this team.
Anybody else on defense that'd be worth mentioning in your mind?
Mike did it. So whatever Mike does, we can all get away with, right? Mike mentioned a redshirt freshman. Technically, Brennan, Ellis Robinson IV is a redshirt freshman. I'll save us all 2 or 3 minutes of our time, and I'll just say he's Georgia's best cover corner. Of course, he needs to put on more weight. Of course, he needs to stop the run. But I've heard so many DB gurus talk to me about Ellis, and they always ask these questions, DB trainers, DB quotes. And it's like, man, Kirby needs to figure out a way. Okay, this guy may give up an extra 3 or 4 yards on the ground, but he's not giving up 35 yards downfield like Georgia saw against Ryan Williams. And he's dynamic. When we look at the recruiting rankings, Brandon, he is the second highest rated player ever behind Justin Fields to sign with Georgia. And he had a great spring practice, turned the ball over a lot, got challenged a lot, but also turned the ball over more than any other guy in the secondary.
I think that's interesting. And Connor, I'll bring you in on this because, everything I've heard, I think that people are pretty happy with Ellis Robinson, that Robinson is well on his way to being maybe a good football player, but in a competition for playing time right now. We've talked about this on the show in recent days. Sounds like Daniel Harris has used his experience pretty effectively here. So my guess is we will see Robinson playing, but I don't know that I get the indication that Robinson's ready to overtake Daniel Harris for a starting spot. What do you think?
I agree with you there. I think coming out of G-Day, I think Daniel Harris has gotten a lot better than where we were at the end of the 2024 season. Look, there's still a long way to go. There's a whole fall camp before Georgia opens the season against Marshall. And given you play Marshall a little bit of the season, you play Austin, play Pete, even a Tennessee team where you don't really know what their quarterback situation is going to look like at this point in time, you have some time to figure some things out at the cornerback position. But I think for Georgia, again, if Ellis is going to get on the field for Georgia, to Jeff's point, he's going to have to earn his way on it because you bring back Dalen Everett, who is a rock-solid cornerback in this league. Daniel Harris looks like how a cornerback should look in terms of you building one in the lab. And I'll even throw out a redshirt freshman, too, here since we're all throwing one out. Yeah. Like, don't sleep on DeMello Jones either. Okay. I know he was probably maybe behind a little bit in terms of what we saw at a G-Day, but that's just 1 out of 15 practices. And this guy has the dog in him that you need to play in Kirby's secondary. So I think that this secondary, it's going to be fascinating to see how it all turns out. Well, yes, Daniel Harris does have a year up on Jones and Robinson. All 3 of those guys, in my mind, are someone who is capable of playing winning football this fall. And I'm interested in seeing how Kirby Smart, Dante Williams, Tavares Robinson go about using these guys to maximize this defense.
Floor open to anybody. Any other, and I'll let you do redshirt freshman if you want to, either side of the ball. Any other freshman, redshirt freshman, somebody wants to shout out here before we change the subject?
I'll throw one out as a redshirt freshman. Drew Miller is someone to keep an eye on because Brett Thorson is coming back from an ACL, MCL injury. It's his plant leg. I do wonder how quickly he's going to be ready to go at the start of the season. We know how important special teams are to Georgia. Played a part in them losing that game against Notre Dame, albeit on a kickoff. But Drew Miller had a 64-yard punt on G-Day, and I thought that was very impressive in how he did that. So someone who, again, made his first start in that game against Notre Dame was just okay, certainly wasn't what Thorson was at the position. But Drew Miller is someone to at least pay attention to, at least in the early part of the season, as Brett Thorson tries to recover from an ACL and MCL injury.
Very interesting. Let's get ready to shift gears here now to cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And let's remind you that when you think about awesome stuff happening with the Royal Caribbean here in 2025, the new stuff keeps right on coming. Now, for our DawgNation cruise, we're on the newest, for now, Royal Caribbean cruise ship. That's Utopia of the Seas. It's the latest in the Oasis class of ships. But coming up later on this summer, it's going to be the debut of Star of the Seas. That's the second in the Icon class of ships. And it's going to be another incredible experience for those who get a chance to be a part of it. And boy, I am crossing my fingers that I get a chance to see some of Star of the Seas here upcoming in 2025 to sort of see what they've kind of copied from Icon of the Seas. And they'll always have some new stuff there too. The expanded Royal Promenade, for instance, so many fun things when it comes to Star of the Seas. I hope, I really feel like if I'm going to be good in my role of ambassador for Royal Caribbean, I've got to be on the latest cruise ship to come back and tell all of you all about it. So hopefully I get my chance to do that, maybe sometime in August. You can also get your chance to be among the first to sail on it as well. How about Jessica Slater? You can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. You want to learn about Star of the Seas or the debut of the brand new Cocoa Beach Club there at Paradise Island, the Bahamas. Get a chance to, Royal Beach Club. Cocoa Beach Club is at Perfect Day Cocoa Cay. If you want Royal Beach Club at the gorgeous, right there at the port in Nassau, incredible experience. That debuts later on this year too. Jessica can tell you all about that. In fact, my errors, she'll correct them for you as well. So you can get going on all of that. And as we're cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean here today, I want to tell you all this. One of the things we did this a year ago, and y'all may not remember this, you very well not, but I remember it vividly. I really like crowdsourcing information sometimes because when I threw this topic out to y'all a year ago, really, I think all three of you may have mentioned this in a way that I wasn't considering, and it turned out to be true. When I a year ago said, hey, give me a team kind of outside the SEC that could, perhaps contend for the college football playoff, all three of you, my memory is, mentioned Notre Dame. And obviously they ended up being bad news for Georgia because the Irish beat Georgia. But putting that aside, really in a spot like this a year ago, we really zeroed in on what became one of the bigger stories of the season, Marcus Freeman's ascension as the Notre Dame coach. So I want to do some of this here today, kind of looking at SEC teams, college football teams outside the SEC that have the early track on the college football playoff. I don't need all 12, and this isn't like an official prediction. These are sort of early days. We're sort of starting a conversation here. So let me begin with kind of the SEC here. Mike, give me a thought on an SEC team right now, other than Georgia, that you would say, right now, this is one of those teams I sort of see having an inside track on the college football playoff. There were 3 a year ago. There'll be at least that many here this year. Give me an SEC team right now that you believe is a likely playoff team.
Texas. I'm all in on Arch Manning. I believe, I know, we sent Jeff Santel down to New Orleans a few years ago, and, he was certainly the apple of Georgia's eye, future of the program, great hope for the Bulldogs, greatness coming, and all indications were that he was coming to Georgia. He liked Georgia. His mother liked Georgia. And Texas came in, with a bag of money. And even though the Manning said it wasn't about money, it turned out to be about money from all my sources that were very close to Arch Manning's recruitment at Georgia and Tennessee, I might add. So I think it's very interesting that he ended up at Texas. I thought he bided his time well, played the role. I thought Texas actually would have been more dangerous with Arch Manning in the SEC championship game and his mobility. I mean, this is a guy that's grown to his frame. I mean, you're seeing this great footage from high school. He looks different now. He's thicker. He's bigger. He's prototypical. He's brilliant. The guy's a monster. And I think Texas has a lot of talent. I think they're very effective in the portal. I think they have a very convenient schedule outside of their trip to Sanford Stadium. So if I were going to take one team above all else that I felt would make the playoff, and yes, even Ohio State, I would take the Texas Longhorns.
Yeah, the only team in America to be in the Final Four the last 2 years is Texas. I'm no fan of the Longhorns, but you do have to say that Steve Sarkisian is really in the midst of a pretty remarkable program turnaround there in Austin. Jeff, we hear Mike mention Texas. Unless you want to make the case for excluding Texas, give me a different team from the SEC that you think right now looks like a likely college football playoff team in 2025.
Yeah, I would really get you cackling if I started in with my Mississippi State takes here, right?
Yeah.
I would definitely. You'd be like, man, is he already on the Royal Caribbean cruise? I would say I like Texas. I think it's going to be really hard to get Manning on the ground is in the run game. I think that's the thing that stands out. I'll throw out a name that some of our audience has maybe heard earlier in the week. I really like LSU quarterback Garrett Nussmeier, especially when he just plays football and doesn't try to play hero ball. And I think this is a pivotal year for LSU. I think they're going to try to really surround him with everything possible. I mean, he comes from a football family. Everybody knows the Nussmeier name going back. His father being an offensive coordinator all around college football. He actually has a younger brother coming up as a new four-star-ish quarterback prospect as well. But I really think at times Garrett Nussmeier clearly looks like last year, clearly looks like the best returning quarterback in the SEC. And then he just would have these little spats and he would have these little, where he just tries to do a little bit too much. So I think your quarterback play has to do a lot here. Mike's instincts are well honed there. I think Texas is the first name you think of. I think LSU is probably the next non-Georgia name you think of in terms of who's going to really get it done and crack into the CFP.
Connor, I know you want to make the case for LSU. I'm going to give you a chance to do that as a setup for that. We can all laugh at what ended up being probably the wrongest I've ever been, and I've been wrong plenty. But going into the 2023 season, I predicted LSU to make the college football playoff with the caveat that they needed to bench Jayden Daniels and put Garrett Nussmeier in as their starting quarterback. And if they did that, they could make the playoff. Well, guess what? Daniels went on to win the Heisman Trophy, and the stuff around him at LSU was nowhere near playoff caliber. So I essentially got that one wrong on both sides of the coin. I won't be quite as bullish on Nussmeier anymore. Not to say that I won't pick him to make the playoffs. I don't know. I feel like I've kind of gone down that well before. But I do think his decision to return was a pretty big deal. I do think the schedule for the Fighting Tigers is somewhat, I think, beneficial for them. Make your case for LSU here, perhaps kind of finding some NIL on defense that the program previously hasn't had.
Yeah, they've gone and leaned on the transfer portal in a way they didn't a season ago. And I think a lot of people before the year pointed out, hey, LSU needs to be more aggressive in the transfer portal. And that played out with how their defense played up and down at times during the season. I think there's better continuity at LSU now. Brian Kelly in his third year, or am I doing that? 22, 23. I think this is his fourth year now at LSU, which just, shows you how time flies. But, they bring back both coordinators this year. Garrett Nussmeier returns as a starting quarterback. I like what they've built there. They have to go to Alabama this year. They have Oklahoma at the end of the year. That's going to be a tricky game. They got to play a lot better against Florida, but that game is at home this season. I just think that with LSU, there is a little bit of pressure on them because it does sort of feel like a now or never year, given what you bring back, what you invested in the portal, and what they have done to this point. Getting the SEC championship in year one, and then that sort of being the high water mark. So I think with LSU, there's pressure on them to perform this year, but I like what they have around them, and they're a little bit more sturdily built in my mind than some of the other SEC teams.
We can do this rapid fire. How about a non-SEC team, Connor? Is there a non-SEC team? I mean, you could say Ohio State, but maybe someone slightly more interesting than that. Is there a non-SEC team that you have your mind on right now?
Clemson's interesting to me. The ACC, I think, is going to be down once again. And look, they only got into the playoff a year ago because they won the SEC or the ACC. Rather, they lose to South Carolina, they lose to Texas, they lose to Georgia. They weren't really competitive in that sense. But in terms of making a safe bet, I feel like Clemson is a pretty good one. They bring back Cade Klubnik. They have quality receivers around him. They're well built on the defensive line entering this season. They actually go out and add some players via the transfer portal. So in terms of a safe bet, in terms of a safe pick, I'll take Clemson here just because Ohio State, Penn State, Oregon, those feel like all very easy answers out of the Big Ten. You could say the same thing for Clemson too, but I like where this Clemson program is headed, at least to get into the playoff in 2025.
I think they're the most interesting non-SEC team in America. I think there's a chance they're better than they were a year ago for all the reasons Connor just mentioned. This could be like a Clemson team sort of back among the national elite here this year, and I did not expect to be saying that, but I believe that's the early read on the upstate. Jeff, how about for you? A non-SEC team that you could see in the college football playoff. And like I said, you can say Ohio State, but it'd be more interesting if you said somebody different.
Yeah, Ohio State would be very, very vanilla. I just think they've got the future Heisman Trophy winner there, and Jeremiah Smith, and an unguardable asset right there. Looking around the rest of college football, I don't really know if there's. I think Michigan will come back this year. I think Michigan will have a lot of their pieces, and maybe this is a lot of incentive, with a lot of players they brought in. But I like Michigan as a team that can probably. Surge forward, capitalize on beating the national champions. I think their identity there and their kind of culture they have there, offensive line, run the rock, physical. I think that's going to play well. It's going to play very well in the Big Ten at times. I don't want to make anybody throw up in your mouth there, but I mean, I'm not going to mention anything about Miami here, but you also got to look at Oregon here as a perennial contender. They've just reached that point.
Yeah, I think you mentioned Michigan. I think Michigan, if Clemson's my most interesting non-SEC team, I believe that Michigan may be my second most interesting team. 1 year removed from a national championship, the possibility of a true freshman starting quarterback in Bryce Underwood. Pretty fascinating team. All right, Mike, we'll finish with you on this. As I said, last year y'all gave me Notre Dame, and it turned out to be, a pretty spot-on prognostication. What do you think about a non-SEC team that's worth monitoring here right now?
Well, you did make me throw up in my mouth when you said Michigan and interesting in the same sentence, if you want to talk about an antiquated offense and an underachieving program. But when we talk about perennial contenders, I agree with Jeff. Connor kind of looked down his nose at Oregon as a pick, but I see Clemson number 7 in the preseason top 25, Oregon 6. I'm a big believer in Dan Lanning. I'm a big believer in Nike money. I'm a big believer in a top-heavy conference. I think Oregon's one that you certainly put in ink in the playoff next year. And if we know anything about Dan Lanning, it's his ability to motivate, and they certainly have plenty of game film from that blowout against Ohio State in the playoffs. So I think you're going to see an even better Oregon Ducks program. Certainly, I think they're going to be everything that they're quacked up to be. As far as the non-traditional power that makes the college football playoff, how about BYU? They bring a lot back. They bring back, I think, 4 of their top 5 tacklers and their quarterback. BYU, a salty program, no pun intended, if you're familiar with the Utah and the Salt Flats being out there. But Cougars should have some bite in the Big 12. And I think they've got a good football coach, certainly one of the more physical, violent teams that you're going to play. You might not expect that from BYU, but ask the teams that play them. So give me BYU is my kind of outside the box playoff team, and I'm going to go with the Oregon Ducks to fly high and make the playoffs next year out of the Big Ten. I
think there's literally no Big 12 team that I couldn't listen to an argument for, BYU included. I think the entire league could at least be have some sort of case made for them. It's a very competitive, entertaining league. Certainly interesting to see where that goes. And honestly, I don't want to get on a soapbox here because we're going long, but of all the teams last year that probably have a better argument for like playoff consideration than anybody else, like the BYU argument, let's go back and look at that from a year ago. Perhaps a much more convincing case of the playoff they were given credit for at the time. Mike could be on to something, although I couldn't tell you a single player they're bringing back. But based on how they performed a year ago, perhaps probably deserved more playoff consideration than they got. For now, though, we'll call that cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean, and we'll wrap up today's edition of our DawgNation Roundtable. Another great day of our DawgNation Roundtable. Really appreciate Jeff, Mike, and Connor giving me as much time as they did and really giving it to all of you, a way of kind of doing something a little bit different with our showtime here this week while we're on our DawgNation cruise. And before we say goodbye to you today, I want to give a shout-out to our friends at Zagoria Law. It seems like every time you go on the news, there's some sort of horrific story about a horrible dog bite incident. It feels like the kind of thing, there's just more of that than there used to be. And listen, our pets are obviously beloved, but when someone doesn't take proper care for their pet, when they act negligently with their animal, especially, some of these very large and dangerous dogs, well, obviously that can create a huge problem. And you may have personal history with this. Maybe somebody has been bitten or injured by a dog. Maybe that's your own story. If that is the case, then like any other situation involving personal injury, well, we would say that you deserve the chance to fight for your compensation. You've got pain and suffering. You maybe have medical bills. And I think that when it comes to a situation like that, in this specific case, our friends at Zagoria Law are really a resource you need to know. They are the official dog bite injury lawyers, the Georgia Bulldogs. They literally, and I mean this literally, wrote the book on how to win cases, perhaps like the one that you're maybe going to experience. They have specialized in kind of how to serve people who have been bitten or injured by a dog that wasn't your own, improper care, negligent care by the owner. Well, in a situation like that, they want to fight for you. So I want you to reach out to them. Give them a call, 833-GA-DOGBITE, D-O-G, 833-GA-DOGBITE, spelled conventionally, or find them online, ZagoriaLaw.com. That's Z-A-G-O-R-I-A, ZagoriaLaw.com for more on that today. Of course, we got golden shoes for you again next week. We've got our DawgNation cruise rolling on this week, and to get to Port Canaveral where the ship sails out of, you got to drive right past Gainesville. I said this the other day. You got to go right through there. And listen, all these years going to Port Canaveral for this cruise, straight down the Florida Turnpike, you got to go 75 past Gainesville. Always feeling really good knowing that there ain't nobody on that exit, ain't nobody in that zip code that can say anything to any of us, because Georgia's beating them in football, beat them in basketball. We don't recognize their national championship. Swept them in baseball. Good stuff. In fact, when it comes to the situation involving football, how about this number? 1,628 days. That's how long it's been since Florida has beaten Georgia. That is our Gator Hater Updater. We love giving that to you each and every day. Even when we're not here live, Gator Hater Updater is still there for you. Have a great day. See you tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. And on video time now for the R.S. Andrews cooldown. We got one big day of DawgNation roundtables coming for you tomorrow. Then on Friday, Connor will have you covered when it comes to the reaction to the first round of the NFL draft. At that point in time, it'll be time for me and the rest of my DawgNation friends to kind of come back to reality, get back to dry land, and make our way back home. Now, I'm always happy to do that because I have a great life, great job, great family. So even fun travel when it comes to an end, there's never that sad feeling or anything like that. You're happy to return back to your normal life. But it is a jolt when you kind of get back to sort of eating normal food again, normal consumption habits again. Some of that's always a little bit of a jolt. But nonetheless, y'all find R.S. Andrews online, rsandrews.com. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. What's not a vacation is if your water heater goes out. That's one of those things where everybody in your house is in a bad mood. Nobody's getting hot showers. And if you've got that situation, the good news is you can have it fixed, boom, almost right away. Our friends at R.S. Andrews, in many cases, can replace it for you the same day. That's what the RS is all about. RS stands for Rapid Service. One of the reasons why we've been saying that story after story, R.S. Andrews has been putting smiles on the faces of people in our audience for a very long time, and they can do the same thing for you. Whether it's plumbing emergency, some sort of electrical issue, obviously this time of year, people prominently thinking about those air conditioning systems. Our friends at R.S. Andrews want to help you out with all of that. So find them online, rsandrews.com. That is rsandrews.com. One final day, DawgNation Roundtable tomorrow. It's going to be a good one. More bold predictions about the upcoming year. And there are some doozies. We'll give it to you then and talk to you then. It is DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management.